Okay, so my topic is American prisons. There are over 2 million inmates in prisons across America. Correctional officers work in these prisons in order to keep, in order to keep prison inmates safe. Lately, there have been cases of many correctional officers abusing the power they've been given. This brings me to my main point. Correctional officers across America are mistreating inmates. My first secondary claim is that correctional officers have begun to use torture-like punishment against inmates. My second is inmates with mental disabilities are receiving punishments for things they may not have control over. And my third point is that there have been many instances of death caused by the brutality of correctional officers. So going back to my first point, correctional officers are using torture-like punishment against inmates. The use of chemical gases against inmates is a popular example of torture as punishment that is being used across American prisons and is growing rapidly. So these chemical gases are often used in the prison system to control large riots, but according to Deborah Davies, they're actually beginning to be used among individual inmates as punishment. These sprays often come in large fire-type extinguisher canisters. If enough is sprayed, a rash or chemical burn may develop to exposed skin, according to Anne-Marie Heldenstein, who is a PhD. For example, an inmate in Florida State Prison named Sylvester Butler received second-degree burns when he was sprayed with pepper spray and tear gas for banging on his cell door. The restraint chair is another example of torture-type punishments among inmates. The human restraint chair was created to help protect violent inmates against themselves and others around them. According to Anne-Marie Cusack, the restraint chair prevents any movement of arms, legs, or the torso. So in many recorded instances, the restraint chair has not been used for its original purpose, but is instead used as a form of punishment. So correctional officers have placed inmates in these chairs for as long as 8 days. In some cases, correctional officers fail to place limbs correctly in the chair, creating blood clots. There have been cases of abuse while in the chair, included with being pepper sprayed and beaten. Then there's my second point, which inmates with mental illness receive torture punishment from correctional officers. A study done by the U.S. Department of Justice Bureau showed that 64% of local jail inmates, 56% of state prisoners, and 45% of federal prisoners have shown symptoms of serious mental illnesses. There have been many reported instances of abuse and neglect towards these inmates. According to Naomi Spencer, a mentally ill inmate by the name of Timothy Souders died after being abused and neglected while in the Southern Michigan Correctional Facility in Florida. Timothy suffered from depression, bipolar disorder, and manic episodes. He was shackled naked by his arms and legs to a concrete slab in temperatures exceeding 100 degrees. He was in this position and in this state for 5 days until the time of his death. Correctional officers administered this punishment simply because Timothy had overflooded his beak. Another example of abuse against mentally ill patients is one against a Florida State prisoner who was tased as a punishment for not cooperating with correctional officers for not getting in his wheelchair. According to Deborah Davies, his lawyer claimed that he suffered from mental handicaps. The inmate convinced himself that he had suffered a back injury, so it prevented him from walking, and that's why he refused to get in his wheelchair. On to my third point, the instances of death caused by brutality of correctional officers. With this torture-like punishment occurring, it's not surprising that the cruelty of many correctional officers has resulted in recorded deaths. One specific instance is the famous case of Frank Valdez. He was an inmate in Florida State Prison who was on death row. He was found dead in his cell, according to Deborah Davies, was killed by correctional officers. One specific correctional officer was given immunity in the case if he revealed how all correctional officers aided in the brutality of Frank Valdez. The correctional officer stormed into his cell and beat him on 2 different occasions. After the second, he was found dead. This is just one instance of brutality leading to his death, but according to other studies, 70 deaths a year occur from punishment, including tasing. So this brings me to my conclusion that correctional officers are often faced with situations where force is necessary to keep order. But it seems as if these officers have crossed the line from force to torture. They have begun to abuse their power, and no good seems to have come from this abuse.
right, the subject's identified pretty clearly. You've got some nice statistical information in the introduction. You do label your proposition. I think it's a little bit broad, and I think you need to explain, because there's no doubt that abuse exists. The question is, how widespread is it? And you're making a generalization about the system, so I'm going to, I assume that you mean that it's fairly wide in terms of its practices. You had a good preview of what the supporting points were. You signpost that first point when you get to it. Basically, the first information that you have comes from a source that you cite. I don't know who she is and how she knows these things. And the first point doesn't even make it doesn't do anything except describe what chemical gases are supposed to do. It's the second place where you have an example where it's being used, and I'm not exactly sure that the example falls outside of the purview of the use of this particular product. And what the long-term consequence to the prisoner in that situation is also not clear. It sounds like a lawsuit waiting to happen, not necessarily a case of institutional abuse. Now, the restraint argument run into the same problem. On the first part, the first evidence that you have simply describes what it is, and then the supporting evidence is many recorded instances. I don't know where that came from. And then later on, there are cases of abuse, and I don't know where that came from. So if there's an authority that says this and has some examples of those recorded instances or can name the cases of abuse, they ought to be in the argument. Your transition to the second point needs to be a little bit smoother, but it was clear where that point was. The labeling on your evidence was fine. The issue about mental illness, again, I'm not sure there's any controversy on the frequency of mental illness in prison institutions. The question is, can it be managed in some other way that doesn't require the use of physical force or abuse? Now, the Michigan case that you have, for instance, sounds like a pretty harsh example that you're using to illustrate this point. How typical is that kind of application of force to the people who are mentally ill? And this case, especially if the person's locked naked in 100-degree plus temperatures, posted there, and they're there for 5 days, I can't imagine that there wasn't some legal investigation on this. That sounds like actually what you're quoting, in which case this abuse was clearly illegal. It was prosecuted, or likely to have been prosecuted. The Florida State case that you have right after this, when you're talking about them going in, and on the third point, going in and beating the death row prisoner to death, it sounds like that's exactly what happened. One of the officers took immunity, testified against his cohorts in a prison case. So I'm not exactly sure that this abuse is either inherent or accepted, that it exists. I don't think there's a lot of dispute that some abuse exists. Now, is it characteristic of the prison system? That's where you would have to make an inference, and that's where I think you need a little bit more information. All right, thank you.